So we have the sound, excellent. I'm Semyon Rogachev, hello. I'm the Incident Reaction Manager in the Bastion company, and I will speak about a few attackers at once. I would like to highlight the attribute-related things and also think about attribution when a group of the attackers are not working on their own. It's a difficult situation in terms of any incident handling, cyber security. So we'll start with a few paradoxes. We'll talk about the tools and instruments, and then we'll consider a few cases with a growing complexity. So, the introduction. So what's this presentation is going to be about? It will be made out of a few blocks that I would like to discuss right now. What data do we have from telemetry and without telemetry that we get for investigation, and where do we get the most of the data? Then I suggest that we discuss, is this data enough to make a confident attribution, followed by examples of multiple compromises, what we're going to do about that, and how do we attribute the attacker. There's a bit of a spoiler. There's not going to be simple answers. Everything is difficult. Now we're going to speak about why we need telemetry. Well, there's a very simple answer. We need telemetry for high-quality context. We implement telemetry for better monitoring, etc. But in terms of attribution, TI, etc., we require maximum context. We need to understand how this or that hackers work in the infrastructure, how they implement different tools, etc. If this telemetry does not exist, attribution becomes very questionable. Having a high-quality telemetry, we can handle high-quality attribution. The default OS settings give us much less data to explore than we would like. The context is lacking there. Speaking in terms of Linux, seems like very often it makes you cry. It looks really sad in Linux. Additional telemetry gives you complete and full chronology. When if there are a few attackers from a few entry points operate in the most critical part of the infrastructure. So in this situation, if you don't have the exact time steps of all steps, it would be difficult to tell them from one another. It becomes very difficult. At the same time, we have better understanding of tools, having a good telemetry. How can you prove that? The actual fact of having the tool is not going to give you much. The modern pen testers, they have multiple options of execution, and the responder is available to all of the attackers. You can take it from GitHub, but how do the attackers use it exactly? Which elements of the command prompt they use it? This is the unique data based on which you can do the attribution. It's a much more visible fingerprint. If we don't have these visible fingerprints, then the quality of attribution really drops. Without telemetry, you cannot pull this out. That's what I mean. In actual fact, we have full TTPs, the description of the attacker with all of the details. But there's just one side note, and there's a bit of a paradox, logical paradox, which I'm going to describe. What happens if telemetry doesn't exist? But we'll answer this question a little bit later. But the most interesting question is, and most importantly, in which infrastructure does the attacker most fully implement his TTRs? in an infrastructure with telemetry or without. So the question is, in terms of business, we've implemented this telemetry. The telemetry works, is monitored. We've created SOC to detect the attacks, and we do it just for the sake of the attacker to be detected at very early stages. And the detection at the very early stages actually allows us to block the attacker and kick the attacker out of the system with less effort. We're not going to have a shutdown. We have a very small isolation of the network compared to the fact that if they rooted deeply, we would have that. A shutdown and things. So telemetry really deeply search for the attacker, but it also limits the number of stages. So you may evaluate the attack in different ways. So telemetry really limits the number of stages at which we can actually observe the attacker, or it's supposed to do so at least. So there are excellent situations when there is telemetry and nobody actually uses this, but it has quite a lot of questions whether you spend your money wisely, spend your money on monitoring wisely, etc. So we have this little paradox. Not every company, just for the sake of our research and for the sake of quenching the thirst of knowledge for us to create new ways of detections, will turn themselves into a guinea pig, and you'll come up to a company, you see, we have interesting attackers, let's use your company's infrastructure, let's have them there in the system, and we'll just prevent the attack just in the very nick of time, because we would like to have this deep research. I think you would get a no, and the person who would come up with such a proposal will definitely be fired just for proposing that. Honey nets are created specially to do that, but they are not ideal, because creating them is taking a lot of pain in the butt, and other things come in place that are not very nice as well. So on the one hand, without telemetry, we have limited capability for research, but with telemetry, we have limited stages for research. Seems like that there is paradox. A lot of telemetry, bad thing. Too little telemetry, bad thing. You may accidentally catch the entire pathway of the attacker, and the attacker is not going to be kicked out. Well, we can't hope on that. So we result in a situation with which our team of incident management sees the most. We always have accessible sources of data, and having research on these available data sources is always possible. Whether it's lucky, whether it's in rotation, the log in rotation, whether it's not in rotation, whether they cleaned up the traces, whether they have not cleaned up the traces, I mean the attackers, doesn't matter. But we may identify the entry point, we may identify how and exactly what they did. This is a realistic task to do, but for attribution, especially in a very severe conditions here in Russia, in terms of attackers from Ukraine, it becomes a much more difficult task. A typical example here for you. Imagine that you are somewhere in the shim cache, you catch a PC host in the wrong directory. We have it in a big hash, we have removed it from the disk, you can't restore it. Well, obviously there was a malware file. We assume it was, because there's a masquerading, and we have the timestamp in the cache. So what are we supposed to do with that? Seems like that they don't have too much valuable data there. We are unlikely to get it. So there's, on the one hand, you'd say that the attacker used the sliver is one thing. On the other hand, if they used the sliver to do the injection, and that injection had its own address of the control server, is a different thing. It's the context which helps you here come up with unique data, and only with unique data you can have attribution and not clustering, not clusterization. So we always have logs with us, journals, process launch traces, and we just need to believe that we get lucky. In actual way, if you react, seems like that you do some attribution, but it's very biased. It's based upon your intuition, your own experience. You take a look at this and say, okay, I guess I can see this looks like this, and this resembles me that, but I don't think that we can find a lot of useful context out of it. There are some people, different groups attribute this in different way, like for example ransomware. Anton, Andrei, you did that, and I liked what you do. Keep up the good work. But these are the things which are the things that we have to do, but they don't turn out to be of a high quality solution group. It was the first stumbling block for us, which was about attribution. Now I would like to speak about the difficulties in the analysis. You can see the question is, how do we tell the attackers if the open source is always available? Finance-interested attackers, sponsored attackers. All of the attackers use open source solutions, even the sliver that I already mentioned. So I'd say that if all of a sudden there is a client with the entry point of the vulnerable Linux-based server, I will obviously find the Linux user there. If we have a Windows-based infrastructure, it would be much more difficult, but obviously there would be a Dericon, Xenon Passwords Pro, and Mimikatz, something like that. And that's open source available tools. So it has a few important moments here. These things are really easily traceable and detectable. You know where to find them, where they are likely to belong, under which names. Everything works quite simple. It's no rocket science. Everything has a different problem. A different problem here is if you find an open source tool, in terms of attribution, seems like you didn't find anything. If you don't have enough telemetry to find some unique things, this has no use in it. Everybody knows how to use the showdown. Not everybody, but I suspect a large number of people can use the showdown. And in GitHub, when you have exploits with well-known vulnerabilities with high level of criticality and with the difficult patch management, so we don't understand how come they came up to exist in Russia in 2022. That's a question. So it's difficult to trace something in the attacker's moves. You need to find tricky ways to track it down. So what we see is that all of the attacks, all of the mass attacks, can be conducted exclusively by using open source tools. So what are we left with? Just some part of the infrastructure sections reserved IP addresses. These are the things that we left. So, but what about if that's a Proton VPN? Proton VPN IP address does not look like a good traceable thing. What are you going to do about it? So it seems like we have to live with the TTP analysis. It's a good story, but there's another side note about TTP. The question is, do the attackers really learn using their attack data? Because threat intelligence activities are mostly about activities around PR. So your company describes the behavior of the hackers, their tools, and how it can be detected, etc. But on the one hand, These public activities potentially increase the protection state of the company, but it's just potential, because if they just read the report, it does not increase the probability. It's a very complex process, which is not the only one. You need to introduce this monitoring, you need to test it, and it's very difficult. And the attackers don't have such a problem. They have a perfect way of seeing, by analyzing TI data, that how others breach the system, successfully do their malicious things, etc. So in actual fact, we face a very funny situation. We disclose the information. That's an important thing. I'm not going to argue with that. Even if we get abstract, it's especially important for your PR reasons. It's a stupid thing to deny. On the other hand, we play with a sharp two-bladed sword, because they can pick up this data from us and learn something and use it against us. So in the world where all of the attacks are conducted with the open source tools, not all of them, but I'm just exaggerating it for dramatic effect, but a lot of things are conducted with the open source tools. And on the other hand, we share this information with the attacker, what they need to use at which stages. So in this case, where do we find the unique things? So we don't have too many options left. Either we have some unique tools, either we have a unique infrastructure, or with abundant telemetry we can rely upon TTPs. All the other things are not that reliable. So these are not easy things to speak about. In addition to what I've just said, let us enhance the level of complexity once again. So it doesn't rain, it doesn't rain, but it pours. Sometimes in Russia we have mass cases. Approximately there are 15% of the incidents. When we have research, it seems like that the attacker wasn't there alone, or at least there's no evidence that it was just one attacker. So we are just coming up to multiple compromises, and that provides yet another difficulty. I was trying to find a guaranteed list, but unfortunately I didn't find multiple compromise examples. If you disagree, you may disagree, but that's just for understanding that we speak the same language, more or less. Multiple compromises is a situation where two or more attackers operate simultaneously or sequentially in the same corporate environment. An example would be initial access broker compromised the device in the infrastructure by using showdown, but it doesn't really matter what they used. And then they conducted some research and they sold access. They conducted some initial reconnaissance and sold access. So we see multiple compromises. They breached the outer perimeter, they did basic scanning, they did that just to understand the actual price for access, and then they sold it. I also have this inner division into parallel, consecutive, and multiple compromises. But briefly, I will explain where logic hides here. But I don't think that you will need it.
Отличный пример с initial access брокером, то есть кто-то проломил внешний периметр, дальше залетел.
The first example would be the initial access broker.
Последовательная, но множественная все же компрометация.
Examples, it's multiple compromises. Parallel one, there may be multiple cases, but I think that the parallel one is that through one access point or through a few of them, a few people trying to establish an infrastructure. But the coordinated one, it's the type of multiple ones which is related to the information that we don't have. And they are all about this idea that among the groups of the attackers, there are other different subgroups. There are people of different incidents. They are interested about same infrastructure, but they have different motivation. For example, there is a cluster of the activity with one group and one subgroup which is interested about espionage, about data upload, and the second one being activists. That's my internal division. So I do not want to give any exact definitions, but more or less you understand what I mean right now. Speak the same language. So when we very frequently saw the situations when we had to suspect multiple compromission, exploit public testing net. That's the statistics which shows us cross-correlation. Seems like it's not different from other things. Exploit public-facing application, exploit public-facing app is on top. It's in top 3 of the vectors of breaching the infrastructure. And again, I would like to thank Showdown and GitHub a lot for that, because it's a very easy vector to utilize. Especially this vector becomes critical with patch management, because we have problems with patch management in the Russian Federation. But I should point out that patch management is not just our problem.
Если все умеют пользоваться Shodan,
So if everybody know how to use Showdown, if they know how to search for CVEs, if you have public access, you are open to a big number of potential attackers. If the simplicity increases the number of potential attackers, it will definitely enhance the chance of crashing. And repeated incidents, I have a few examples. The typical thing is that incident is not fully investigated and people don't find the root causes of their occurrence. And obviously, they don't patch the exchange because no one has ever thought about it. They don't clean up the infrastructure, etc. So you result in a very noticeable time gap, which radically complicates the investigation. So you saw there was one type of activity, and then it's over, another started. You saw the traces of the previous incidents and whether they were connected and whether they were not. Again, coming back to this idea of having no telemetry, I don't think it's easy to answer. So, overall, we may come up with a bunch of ways of how the attacker can pull off these multiple compromises of the infrastructure, like using phishing, etc. But that's the most frequent thing that we see, and that's what other examples are going to be dedicated to. So we're going to take a look at another example with a very easy level. We're not taking attribution into account. We count the attackers, and one hand will be enough to count them. The time length is the same, but the time when the incidents occurred is shifted randomly by me, because there are a few cases that are made public, and I wouldn't want you to guess what I actually mean here. So the first thing is the start of the incident. It was in October of 2022. The attacker gets access to the vulnerable exchange, and that was proxy shell, if I'm not mistaken. So they upload the web shell there. After a while, with no telemetry, after a while, they launch ransomware, and in 2022, In that first incident in 2022, we detected the ransomware just because of the icons that it left. So we launched the logbit on the exchange, and there was no investigation conducted of the first incident. They just restored exchange from backup. So seems like it's no big deal. They have 15 billion annual turnover, and the admin was way too busy running around doing things. So he just need to restore it. There were no resources, there was no experience of doing that. So what do we see? There was continuation of the incident in November 2023. Same exchange launching Zen All Passwords Pro, Add Recon, and Grok. If there are people who do the incident research, we see that you can't tell anything about this excellent number of excellent instruments. 3 days later, the user who came from Exchange launches the miner on several servers. And finally, in April 2024, there was authentication via ngrok, left in 2023, launch of AD Recon, and in 5 days they centralized the launch of Lockbit. Lockbit centralized launch in 5 days. Who thinks it was the same attacker in all of the 3 instances? Are there such people who believe that it's true? Please raise your hands. Okay, if you think so, it's good. We cut down the first incident. Who thinks that November 23 and in 2024 April are the same people? Excellent. Thanks for show of hands. Who thinks that there are several attackers? More people like that. You don't want any simplification. Excellent. So the question here is, when you don't have telemetry and you feel like you are Sherlock Holmes, if there was just one attacker, how come they launched a recon a few times? Why a few times? Why 2? Why do you launch AD Recon twice? Why do you need a miner? How come you do it with a miner? What are you going to mine? $100? Of course, it would be a nice addition, but we don't need to use a miner. And why did it take so long in between the 2 launches, the AD Recon launches? Did you forget something or what? Why did it take so long? But the actual fact of launching the miner actually changes the whole picture. We don't understand the motivation. Maybe it was not the access broker who wanted just to do it both ways, to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, get access rights and earn some money. But if there are a few attackers, different paradoxes arise. If the final access acquired in April 2024, they didn't have enough time for full investigation of the infrastructure. So finally, between the launch of the AD Recon and Lockbit, there was just 5 days difference. It was not that we found too many traces of active investigation since AD Recon was launched, but it's possible that it's just because of the limited telemetry. So that's a very sweet target, but it seems like that they spent too little time for reconnaissance, just 5 days. Initial access broker should have launched the ransomware. You would say, no, it's not our business, it's not our thing. That's right, but on the other hand, having the full administrative launch is a good thing. You can do whatever you like. The admins don't check the antivirus software, and you can launch Lockbit. For example, the builder of Lockbit was available at GitHub. That was for sure.
любым способом.
You just needed to launch logbit in a centralized way. That's all. So it looks strange. So if you think about it, not everything is very obvious, and you would not have reacted very obviously to that.
По факту тут не все так просто.
The fact is that there are more than one
Решаем вообще
hacker,
более простую проблему, чем
but it's not that simple. Apart from attribution, we just would like to count the attackers in the infrastructure where we don't have telemetry. This primitive scenario shows us that we cannot use a simple binary answer. Yes, no. It's very subjective, it's very biased, and we can't turn these guesses into numbers. All right, I'm going to show you yet another example, a bit complicated. This is to show that between the groups there are additional links. They cannot be analyzed. An example is excellent. It's not just about attribution completely, but it's interesting. The first incident took place in May 2003, probably through RDP brute force the attacker gains initial access, because they frequently do that. The profile matches exactly the DC help group. It matches it perfectly. Especially they created OTRS account, PS Resec, BAT, descriptor. It looks exactly like that. Ideal combination. So the attempt of the centralized launch of descriptor is blocked by antivirus protection. It was not fully investigated. And it continued in April 2024. They said, they're working with a big company. We had an incident. We need to run an investigation so that we continue working with them. We say, yes, okay. We start investigating this incident. That's what followed in April 2024. That's the main and very strange paradox started. Those of you who faced DC help attack, you know that they used a very specific account with a very specific password. That OTRS account created was manifested in that attack because the attacker authenticated with the RDP, with the external IP address from which they would not be able to pull out anything without brute forcing the password. So they just input the password from the first attempt. The password was simple, but you could not guess it. In the standard brute force list, such password is not available. And the brute forcing efforts are visible, but this OTRS attacker hit it with just the first attempt. And then in their tools, they have the utility to shut down the antivirus software. It seems like that they learned something. But from this time, they don't run a descriptor, they launch a blackbit. There are no TTPs, there are no ways that signal that. TTPs have nothing to do with the DCP helper. This one was manually launching blackbit ransomware, the blackbit ransomware. From notable differences, I should say that they use the full disk encryption. This uses file encryption. These guys didn't shut down the antivirus software. This time they shut down this software. They used everything utility, however, everywhere. This time it's a good piece for analysis.
Давайте тоже.
Right now, I should ask you a simple question. Do you think in this example there was just one attacker or many? Who thinks it's just one?
Какое-то количество людей есть, пускай мало. А кто считает, что...
Okay, a few people think so. Who thinks that there were a few?
Да.
Okay, more people. How come they get the common password? Where did they get the password? The access to password was sold. Again, it demonstrates the fact that between the attackers, they have additional connections, like they know each other personally, they socialize, mingle, and you can't actually trace it technically. So there may be a hypothesis about how it happened. You may fantasize about where they got it from. Maybe one actor moved from one group to another. Maybe something else happened. Maybe those Blackbit guys, of course, Blackbit guys know which passwords are left by the DC help people. So there are many options, but we're guessing, and technically it would be not quite possible to prove it. So after handling a few examples, we are getting close to the final example, which includes all possible issues and difficulties. It has no telemetry. It has interesting connections between the attackers, the same entry point using the public vulnerability. The third example is the hard level example, but finally it's about attribution. So this incident looks like this. In March 2024, a company faces a ransomware attack, and there was an encryption attempt, and a pro-Ukrainian group of attackers takes responsibility for that incident. During the course of the investigation, we find the entry point, despite there were a few problems with logs, etc., but we restored the chain and successfully reached the entry point. In the incident, we found interesting traces on different dates. That's what we're going to focus on. One of the strangest things that we detected was about the entry point. And what does it look like? The entry point with these two incidents is one Giro server. But the traces there indicate multiple compromises. The first signs of compromise and consolidations show the entry point date back to September 2023, and the second traces were detected in February 2024. What are the differences on this entry point? On the one hand, the traces of the first compromise are associated with a unique toolkit that has not been described before. On the other hand, there are certain overlaps in the actions after the first and second compromises. We discovered a time frame of activity after first compromise. After September 2023 to the beginning of February 2024, the discovered time frame of activity after the second compromise, compromise on Giro server, is late February 2024 and to March 2024. So here we have a few issues here. They don't have the exact time frames which would separate the incidents. So here we go. A few comparative charts. The first compromise. We have the use of the G socket, and we pin using G socket. Why use G socket? Those of you who research the pro-Ukrainian attackers don't find this behavior suspicious. So in order not for them to pin there with three different ways, you can't imagine that. They always do that. Then they use the TCP dump in the first case, and the second attempt, they simply launched the scanner. Not the scanner, they used the F-scan, rather. So those of them are shown here. These are the most interesting, the most useful highlights. I wouldn't want to overload you with screenshots and artifacts. The next thing about the first compromise, which is really a hard one. They use ERAT, then they use the SSH key with the root, writes, and they scanned the infrastructure with the mmap. So what would be the problem here? The problem here is that with the years, once again, we see that the entry point, they used open source tools. So I said that attribution is quite conductable, is quite possible with the use of detection of with the use of the unique tools and unique code. We found it and we detected that. We found the Linux-based version of ERAT. ERAT is the software. ERAT, it's called Y-A-R-A-T. EPT 131, IP31 uses this as a group, and its feature, distinguishing feature, is that with the managing server, they use Yandex Disk. This thing also uses Yandex Disk, however, it has a few differences. It's a Linux-based tool, it's not a Windows-based, and I have not seen the Linux-based YARAT. When we call it YARAT, we do it because the principle of communicating with the Yandex Disk is the same as the YARAT. The more detailed description we give how the APT does, the more the probability that someone would like to repeat that. And this thing also has a few interesting options of launching rootkits with the net-link mechanism. I don't remember all of the details, but these are the things. So that's the first paradox. With the absence of telemetry. The next thing, well, we've left the entry point and we move on. The first compromise, the second one. We see AD reckon here and there. We have PowerShell scripts here and we have PowerShell scripts there. The second compromise. It's not an easy example. The pro-Ukrainian attackers that took responsibility for the attack specifically launch PowerShell-based scripts. They are coded and they go to security, then filtration occurs, and then the attacker keeps the C window stamp in the text file. They keep IP addresses and the names of the users who connected to the device. They do it just to identify what kind of IP addresses belong to admin. So the scripts are the same. They use filtration on Went ID, work with the same data, but they are written in different ways. So if on the one hand, through underscore they have different variables, but sometimes they use camel case. In the first case we have camel case, in the second case we have underscore. The naming is different, the naming of variables is different, but the actual logic is the same. So, how do we make conclusions based on that? We don't know. Then we have the Agent B tool. We couldn't pull it out of the quarantine, but in the second one, they detected Agent B as well. The first example, using system info, task list, net, etc., you understand that. And the second compromise, it was, the old age use of Mimikatz, then all passwords, pro, etc. They did it quickly and they didn't care much. But in the first case, they very carefully, very slowly investigated different groups of users, and there were 90% of cases of interacting with the infrastructure and the users WinRM in 90% of the cases, and that's why we were fortunate to understand what it was all about. So you check out this situation, and it feels like the first group of attackers were doing the investigation very carefully. They were not rushing. They did everything slowly. Judging by the list of the files that we found from the list of errors, they used the daily hijacking. And the second group of the attackers who just rushed in there and they used a very rushed approach. What are the contradictions? Was there just one attacker, or there were a few? We have the same entry point. We have partial overlaps as far as the tools are concerned, the tools used. But we have the public exploit available on GitHub, the G-socket. So they are open source tools, they are common and they are massively used. So it seems like you can't do much of the attribution. On the one hand, they do it approximately at the same time. The difference is 1 week and a half between the first detection of the compromise and the second Jira attempt. But there is a very irrational feeling that the attacker acted much more quietly in the first attempt. It seems like that they were pursuing a different goal. And we can find convincing evidence to that. From the public TI and a non-public TI, and I couldn't really include a high-quality Bison TI, but we faced that as well. This attacker who took responsibility for the attack, we know exactly that they use WinRM. There is evidence that they use WinRM. Seems like that they have WinRM, we can reject this. In the second case, with no telemetry in place, etc., we have to use some subjective metrics and factors. So the infrastructure of the company is very interesting. So maybe it's not the largest one, but in terms of the potential amount of data that you can get from there and get additional access to other systems, it was the most lucrative companies to breach on that year. So the entire attack was conducted in a month. And we have very primitive and very simple, and of course, it's not quite suitable, but still we have statistics. Normally it takes twice as much time on an attack. It was suspicious that they spent so little time on an attack. And in the second case, they didn't have the exfiltration evidence. It's an interesting example. Maybe because we don't have telemetry, maybe. But when we follow the incidents with those who took responsibility, we find such traces. And here we couldn't really find it. And finally, the final nail in the coffin is what looks like ERRAT, but it's not ERRAT. It's not ERRAT. Seems like I spent my monthly quote to find what it's like. ERRAT, not ERRAT. And that thing hangs there on GitHub, but they can't find the match. Seems like it's a unique tool. It's non-describable. You can't find it on GitHub. Where do we actually find additional data to prove what it's all about? Do you think that this pro-Ukrainian attacker is equipped with a new interesting tool? Should we give it some attributes, or we really mean a lot of parallel ways of multiple compromises? It's unclear. So like I said in the very beginning, I'm not going to give you easy answers to these questions. I thought that when I don't know, I just say to my customers, if I don't know, if there is a high probability that there are a few attackers, if there is just one attacker but with some inner division of roles, and I hope I demonstrated that based on the data that we have, we need to make very strict conclusions. It's not true. In any case, we just need to rely upon our intuition and experience. It's a very subjective and biased situation. So let's just wrap up. In the modern world, there are a few difficulties for attribution. Now, I'm not talking about multiple compromises. The more incidents, the less unique traces that we find of the attacker. If we have the external perimeter breached with something vulnerable, the chance to find some radically unique tools is getting very low. The chances of finding it are very low. So attribution also becomes much more complicated by the free circulation of information about the attacks. So on the one hand, different AI vendors do that. On the other hand, different manuals of the ransomware gets public access. So there are less and less unique attacks. Accurately attributing even one attacker without telemetry is quite a difficult task. But if you see that there are multiple suspicious compromises, it is a very challenging task. Maybe you should leave it alone. Maybe you should just work with clusters. Why are we supposed to understand exactly which Ukrainian group attacked you? It's interesting just to identify it for your own reasons, PR reasons, but maybe you should combine them all. And if suspected, we just take the common approach. Why should we specify it? So in order not to make this presentation useless, I'd give you a few recommendations in the end. I think with multiple compromises, especially without telemetry, there are very few sources left to confidently attribute the attacker's unique tools. And the only known way is known infrastructure. We have IP addresses or unique code, and even these things do not guarantee anything to us. One important side note, if you completely rely on the attribution in the attacker's infrastructure, if you see the IP address, if you take the source and this source attaches this IP address to someone, you don't know which data was used here for the first combination. Who actually connected this IP address to the attacker? You don't know. But I think that's one of the best ways to use. The next recommendation, I always contact my friends. Make sure that you contact the TI people. Make sure that these tools are really unique, because they may have very interesting information about these tools that I used. Have they ever seen the phishing instrument ever used for the internal investigation? Because last year I had a few incidents of such kind, and I went to see those guys and asked them the same questions. So hedging your risks. Maybe you don't know that the source code of the incident was published somewhere. You need to take it into consideration. And finally, the general recommendation sounds like this: confirmation bias is evil. We are highly likely to perceive the information which confirms the information we already have. So we fundamentally wouldn't want to criticize ourselves and criticize our hypothesis. Well, it makes us people, human beings, not robots. But in incident response, you just need to limit that approach. Ask your question: how do I know what I know? That's all. Thank you very much.
Я надеюсь, я не настолько сильно...
I hope I was not... I hope it was not a very tiring experience of listening to me. And you still have a few questions.
Да, давайте так.
Okay, let's do it this way.
Еще раз.
Come again?
Я же incident responder, а не SOC builder. Вопрос, конечно, такой.
I'm an incident responder. I'm not a SOC builder. We didn't hear your question because the microphone was not used, but let me answer.
Я считаю, что лучший источник, который у вас есть, это...
Distorted perception. The best telemetry tool is the EDR. Because I think that first and foremost, when I investigate the incidents, I would like to see them. Because in terms of quality price, that's the best thing. Best thing for money.
Один вопрос был или еще один?
Seems like there was just one question.
Можно микрофон как-нибудь или ты покричишь просто?
Maybe you'd use your microphone. But if you don't use the microphone, please shout because I can't hear you. We can't hear the question, I'm sorry.
Так, конец вопроса я не услышал.
All right, I didn't hear the end of your question. I heard about whether those models you mentioned are good enough or not. Question continues, but we can hear it. Here's the answer. The answer is it's highly unlikely. The problem with the scripts seems like that you detect unique scripts are exactly like this. LLMs will create scripts for you, and there will be attribution, and it's becoming hard to do this unique attribution. So I don't think so. Yet another question: have you ever seen such instances? We have suspected that the comments have not been deleted in the code of scripts, but we saw it just once. So it seems like that we saw it once, and what should we base our suspicion on? Apart from those comments that may easily be removed, I don't know. I can't say about the multiple cases.
В силу того, что вопросов было два.
Well, there were two questions, and please choose the book. I know whom I'm going to give this book. I like the question about AI because it's a very relevant question. So the book goes to you. Thanks for your question. Thank you.
Всем спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.